everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to be doing another tutorial in colour pencil for drawing mouths this time. So in the past I've done a tutorial for both drawing eyes and also noses. So for this week's video I'm working on mouths. And again I'm doing this as a two-part series. So this week I am focusing on the top two mouths. So these are the 4 completed mouth drawings that I've done and I'm going to be showing you step by step. So in this week's video I'm focusing on the top 2, so the baby's mouth and also a more natural female's mouth, and then next week I'm focusing on the bottom 2. Anyway, let's get started on today's video. So the colour pencils that I'm using for this tutorial are the Caran Luminance colour pencils, and so I'm starting off with the baby's mouth. And the first thing that I'm doing is I'm using the sepia colour, which is like a dark brown, and I'm using this to outline the shadows. So with a mouth, the shadows tend to be where the creases, so where the 2 lips close and meet. So 3 of the mouths that I'm drawing have got closed mouths. And I'm also drawing the shadows of the folds of the skin, and I'm just doing this very lightly with very little pressure, and I'm using circular motions. It's really important that you don't apply a lot of pressure at the start because we want to apply lots of layers and we don't want to damage the tooth of the paper too early, otherwise it'll be hard for us to apply more layers on top. I'm applying a tiny bit more pressure where the darkest parts of that crease is though. So what I noticed about babies' mouths are that they're quite full and they tend to be quite smooth as well. There's not much texture to them, they are very soft skin. But they do still have some creases and folds in there. Okay, so once I've added all the shadows and established where all the creases and the folds are in the mouth, I started moving on to doing the skin around the mouth. So to do that, I first am using the burnt ochre 10%, which is the lightest of the burnt ochres, and I'm using this just very lightly to establish where the whole of the skin is. And then I'm going in with the burnt ochre 50%, so the slightly darker gradation, and I'm using this on the shadowed regions. So this baby had quite warm skin, that's why I'm using the burnt ochres. As I've said before, when it's cooler skin tones, I tend to use a lot more of the burnt siennas, which have more of a pinkish undertone to them. Okay, so once I've established the skin, I'm moving on to doing the skin of the mouth. And to do this, I'm using the burnt sienna 50% first. So this is to firstly suggest where all the shadows are in the mouth and to mark in the darkest parts, so the shadows cast on the lips, and then I'll go in with the burnt sienna 10%, so the lighter version, and fill the rest in to where all the lighter regions and midtones were. So when you look at lips with any reference photo, you will see different shadows on the lips. So this pair of lips was quite interesting because it wasn't just one type of colour. It had lots of different tones in it. So it had warmer tones and then it had pinkish tones in certain regions. So I used a lot of different colours in this. So once I'd applied the shadows with the burnt sienna 50%, I went in with the burnt ochre 50% and used that on the top upper lip and on the bottom lip. And I used that where the mouth is bleeding into the skin. And this is to create more of a softer transition, and there was more of a warmer tone to that part of the lips as well. And then I went in with the burnt sienna 10%, and I'm using that to fill in the rest of the mouth to add in a base layer, so then we can start to build up the layers and make it a lot smoother. Okay, so once I've added the layer of burnt sienna of 10%, I'm going back in with the burnt sienna 50% to darken up some more of the shadows, because when you add the burnt sienna 10% over the whole of the mouth, it just lightens the shadows up a bit. So I go in and I add some more of those shadows, and it's really starting to build up the layers now, which will make it look even softer. So again, I'm still using circular motions and I'm not applying much pressure at all. Because it's a wax-based pencil, the colour easily comes off. You don't have to work hard and press hard to make these colours blend or to apply the colours. Because it's wax-based and they're really soft, the pigment easily can come off onto the paper. So the paper that I'm using as well is the Strathmore Bristol Plate Surface, and it's the 500 series paper. So it's really smooth, which means that you can get a high level of detail, and it's also really good for blending and getting smooth finishes as well. And it works really well with the wax-based pencils. So now that I've added those shadows, I'm going back in with the Burnt Ochre 10%, and I'm using this with a bit more pressure to really establish the skin around the mouth. I'm not going to talk too much about drawing skin because I've done other tutorials on that, and I just want to focus more on the mouth part of the drawing today. So I'm not spending much time doing the skin, it's just more of block colours to get it in there so I can see some sort of impression of what the skin around the mouth looks like. So even though this baby had warmer toned skin, it tended to be that the mouth was quite cool toned, so I had to use a lot of burnt siennas in the mouth because it wasn't warm like the skin around it. There was a lot of pinkish tones in there as well. Okay, so now I'm going in with the white Caran Luminance colour pencil, and I'm using that to establish where the highlights in the mouth. So using that burnt sienna 10% established the foundation base, so a mid-tone around the whole of the mouth, and we used the burnt sienna 50% to add the shadows. So using the whites gives us the highlighted regions, and this is what gives a level of depth because we have the shadows, the mid-tones, and now we have the highlights on top. So there's a lot of dimension in there and depth. So the highlights in the lips aren't just straight, so you've got to follow the curve that the lips have. And you really have to look at your reference photo to see where the highlights are. Don't just apply highlights wherever you fancy putting them. Really look at your reference photo and just put the highlights where it is in the reference photo. Also, I added the white colour pencil to the Cupid's bow, which is the bit just above the top lip. So there was a lot more highlights around the edge of the top lip of the mouth where it goes into the skin, and also on the bit of the edge of the bottom lip as well. Okay, so now I'm continuing to work on the skin, and I'm using just a lot of different shades now to really get it looking like the reference photo. So the lips are pretty much done. I'm just working on the skin around it. So I'm darkening below the bottom lip. So you will have a darker shadow just below the bottom lip. So it's a lot more set back than your bottom lip is. So your lips come out of the skin a bit more, which means that there's a shadow cast below. And doing this correctly will really make your lips pop and make them look three-dimensional and that they're coming out from the skin. Because the lips aren't flat, if you look at the side of your profile, they're the things that protrude out. So again, I'm just going in and fixing the shadows where there needs to be more depth and pulling out some extra highlights and working on getting all the tones correct. Also, you'll tend to have a shadow where you have the edges of your lips. So on both sides, at the edge of your lip, you will have that little indentation, so a darker shadowed region. Okay, so one of the final things that I'm doing to add a bit more detail to the lips and make them look a bit more realistic is I'm using my crafting knife, and I'll leave a link in the description to where you can buy one of these. So I'm using this knife, and what it does with wax-based pencils is that if you use it correctly, it will lift off the pigment off the paper and leave you with highlights. So I like to use this in hair or in these lips. You can do it for the little cracks and creases, which adds a bit more texture and makes it look a bit more realistic. So with the baby's mouth, I didn't have to do it too much because, like I said, baby's lips were quite smooth and soft. But say something like a male lips, you can use this on the stubble around the mouth and also little cracks in the mouth because they have a bit more texture and probably roughness to them. And if you pull the pigment up with this etching knife, you can then go over the top with the white Caran pencil, and this will give you an even stronger highlight. And also, to get a stronger highlight, you can just apply a bit more pressure to that white colour pencil, and it will give you a better payoff of colour onto the paper. So the last thing that I'm doing to make this pop a bit more is I'm going in with a white gel pen, and this is completely optional, you don't have to do this step, but I like to do this on the wateriest parts of the lips, so where there's the most shine, and also around the edges of the lips in tiny places where there is the starkest highlights. And that is it for the baby's mouth. So moving on to the female mouth, and this is the natural version. So next week I'm going to show you how you can do a female's lip that has lipstick on, because that's a lot different than how you would do a natural lip. So with natural mouths, it's all about making it look like the lips and the skin are one with each other, and you don't want any harsh lines. So the first thing that I do here is I'm working on the teeth and the inside of the mouth, because this mouth was a tiny bit open. So I'm using the sepia for the darker parts and a bit of black, but only in the darkest parts. And then for the teeth, I used a lot of greys and also some browns to give it a bit more warmth, because teeth have a bit more of a yellowish tone to them and a creamish tone. And then once I've done the teeth, I'm moving on to the lips. So I first used the burnt ochre 10% and I applied that completely to the whole of the mouth. And then I went in with the burnt ochre 50% and I used this on a bit more of the shadowed regions. And now I'm just quickly going over the whole of the mouth with the burnt sienna 10%. Next I went in with a colour called Russet, and this is a bit more of a reddish orangey tone, and I used that just on the places where in the reference photo there was a bit more reddish tones to them. So I didn't use a lot of it and I just glazed this colour over, and this just helps with the tone. And then the next thing that I'm doing is again I'm going in with the burnt sienna 50% for the shadows and the burnt sienna 10% for the highlighted regions, or just the mid-tone regions. And then once I've done that, I'm going over with the burnt ochre 10% and I'm just using this on the whole of the skin. But I glaze it over the mouths a little bit as well, just to kind of integrate the mouth into the skin around it. Because like I said, you don't want a harsh line, you want them to be very succinct with each other and to just blend into each other seamlessly. In certain parts you can have more of a distinct edge, but in parts you want it just to look like the lips continues into the skin. So I also used some burnt sienna 10% on the skin as well, and also some raw umbers. So raw umbers are really good for shadowed regions, and I like to use these a lot for my shadows, as well as the sepia and burnt sienna 50%. So now back to the mouth, I'm using the burnt sienna 50% to further establish the shadows, because when I added the burnt sienna 10%, it washed out some of the shadows like before. So where the shadows and highlights are on your lips will completely depend on your reference photo. So it's really important that you look at your reference photo. Okay, so now I'm going in with the Caran white pencil and I'm really starting to establish the creases now. So I'm using this with a bit more pressure and I made sure the pencil was really sharp, and I'm using this to pull out the creases, and I'm making sure that I'm following the curvature of the lips rather than doing straight lines. And I'll use different pressures on the different creases just to make it look like there's a bit more variety rather than just the same white lines all the way throughout the lips. And I also use that white pencil to glaze over the outer edges of the mouth to blend them into the skin as well. So now I'm going in with that crafting knife again, and I'm using this to pull out some extra little tiny creases in the skin and just to give it a bit more texture. And as you can see, these lips look really natural because there's no real harsh line around the whole of the lips. They easily transition into the skin and they've got natural colours. It's not really bright pinks or bright reds. There's subtle tones of reds and pinks, so they look fuller and healthier, and they glow, and they do glow, but they don't look fake and they look really natural. So now I'm just looking at my reference photo, touching it up, pulling out some more shadows and the highlights and working on the skin around it, but I'll be finished with this one. And the final thing that I'm going to do is go back in with that white gel pen and just pull out the tiniest details that are really, really bright in the reference photo. Anyway, that's it for this tutorial. I really hope you found it useful. Let me know in the comment section if you did, and let me know which you prefer out of all of the 4 mouths. So remember, next week I'm going to be doing the other 2 mouths. So the female mouth, which is a bit less natural because it's got lipstick on, and the male mouth, and I'm also going to be showing you how to do blemishes and spots and stubble as well. So if you're new to my channel and you don't want to miss out on them, make sure you subscribe, otherwise you might miss them. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll leave links to all of my social media sites and all of that stuff in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!